She was 23 and homeless. No family, no money, no plan. Just a tin thimble in her coat pocket, and 2 shillings folded into a scrap of brown paper. And with those 2 shillings, she bought a ruined estate in Dry Creek, a forgotten stone house on the edge of a Somerset lane, where the hedgerows had grown across the drive, and the roof had opened to the sky. But what nobody knew, not the solicitor who sold it, not the villagers who watched her walk past with a bundle on her back, was that behind the fireplace wall, sealed under a century of soot and lime, was something that would change her life forever. Settle in with us for this one, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. Emma Reed had been born in the winter of 1849, in a stone cottage 2 miles east of the Somerset village of Dry Creek, the only surviving child of William Reed, a cowman on the Marlbrook home farm, and Hannah Reed, a dairymaid who had died of a lung fever when Emma was 4 years old, and left her husband with a small daughter, a copper-skimming churn, and a garden he did not know how to keep. For a time, Emma had been raised half by her father and half by the older women of the parish, passed from kitchen to kitchen when he was in the byres, and she had grown up quiet, watchful, and unusually still, the sort of child who could sit for an hour with a bowl of peas and shell, every one without dropping a pod. Her father did his best. He taught her to milk before she was 7, and to walk hedges without tearing her skirt, and to know a good egg from a doubtful one by the sound it made when tapped against the rim of a pail, and when he was thrown from a young horse in the spring of her 12th year, and did not wake again, the parish took her in and then out, and the vicar's wife found her a place in service at the rectory at Ashwell, 4 miles down the road. There she met Mrs. Poole. Mrs. Poole was the rectory housekeeper, a widow of 60, with a face like a good loaf of bread, and hands that had never once been idle, and she had come out of Bath 30 years earlier to keep house for a scholar who read Greek at breakfast and forgot to eat his dinner. Mrs. Poole took one look at Emma Reed, standing in the scullery doorway in a cut-down black dress that had belonged to the vicar's late sister, and said only, "Well, child, we shall find work for those hands." And she did. Over the next 8 years, Mrs. Poole taught Emma to bake bread from a stone-cold oven, and to raise a syllabub, to turn a collar and darn a heel, to whitewash a wall and mix a lime plaster, to black a grate and dress a chimney, to draw a poultice from mustard seed and comfrey, to keep a household ledger with the neat down-slanted hand of a woman who trusted no man's arithmetic, and to see, in every broken thing, whether it might yet be mended. In the winter of Emma's 20th year, Mrs. Poole took a chill that would not lift, and one grey morning she called Emma to her bedside, and pressed into her palm a small tin thimble, plain, dented on one side, worn bright at the rim. It had been her own mother's, she said, and now it was Emma's, and Emma was to keep sewing, whatever else the world did to her. Then she closed her eyes and did not open them again. The new housekeeper came out from Wells within the fortnight. Her name was Mrs. Anstey, and she was a thin, capable woman of 42, with a mouth set in a permanent line of accounting, and she brought with her a niece of 19 who was already trained to her ways. There was no cruelty in it, only arithmetic. Mrs. Anstey walked through the pantry on her second morning and counted the jars and looked at Emma, who was kneeling at the range with a length of emery cloth in her hand, and said that the rectory could not carry 3 pairs of hands where 2 would do. The vicar himself came down that afternoon, a mild man who had never in his life dismissed a servant and did not care to begin now, and he stood in the passage, turning his hat in his fingers, and told Emma that he was very sorry, and that he would of course provide a character, and that she might have until Friday to see herself settled. He wrote the character out at his desk that evening, on a half sheet of good paper, in his careful sloping hand, Emma Reed, age 23, honest, sober, industrious, clean in her person, capable in every branch of household work, dismissed for no fault of her own. He signed it and folded it and gave it to her the next morning, with 3 shillings and a small loaf wrapped in a cloth, and he did not meet her eye when he closed the door. Emma did not argue. She went upstairs to the small, slope-ceilinged room she had slept in for 8 years, and she folded her 3 shifts and her 2 aprons, and her spare stockings and her Sunday dress into the same square of sacking she had brought with her at 15, and she laid Mrs. Poole's ledger on top, because Mrs. Anstey had said she had no use for the old woman's hand, and she tied the sacking with a length of twine. She put the tin thimble into the pocket of her coat, where the lining was still whole. She wrote to a laundress at Frome, who had once said there was always work in the coppers, and she wrote to a farmer's wife at Wincanton, who had wanted a dairy girl the summer before, and she waited a week in the village at the Sign of the Ram, paying 3 a night for a straw pallet in the back scullery, and neither letter was answered. By the end of that week, the 3 shillings were 2, and the loaf was gone, and the boots she stood in had come apart at the near heel, and been mended with a strip of leather cut from her own belt. She had knocked at 7 doors, and been told at each of them that times were hard, and that a girl without kin was a risk no household could carry. On the 8th morning, the innkeeper's wife, not unkindly, said that the pallet was needed for a carter coming down from Bristol, and Emma understood that she had reached the edge of what the parish would give. She sat on the bench outside the Ram, with her sacking bundle on her knees, and she took out the 2 shillings, and looked at them a long time in the flat November light, and she folded them into a scrap of brown paper the innkeeper's wife had wrapped a rasher of bacon in, and she put the paper deep into her pocket beside the thimble. Then she stood up and shouldered the bundle and set her face west, toward Dry Creek, because it was the only place in the world she knew the shape of, and because a man at the Ram had said, half in jest and half in warning, that there was a stone house out that way, going for nothing more than the price of the deed stamp, if anyone were fool enough to want it. The road from Ashwell to Dry Creek runs 7 miles by the turnpike, and closer to 9 by the lanes Emma walked, because she had not the 6 for the toll gate at Nunney, and because the lanes were kinder to a boot mended with belt leather than the flint of the high road. She went by way of Whatley and Chantry, and the long climb up under the beeches at Eggford, where the leaves had turned and were coming down in slow brown handfuls with each breath of wind. The sky was the flat pewter color of a Somerset November, and the air smelled of wet oak and coal smoke, drifting from the cottages down in the combes, and once, from a farmyard beyond a hedge, of hot mash being carried out to pigs. She passed a woman driving 3 geese with a switch, who looked her up and down without speaking, and she passed a boy of about 10, sitting on a gate, whittling a piece of hazel, who said good morning to her, because he had been raised well, and she said good morning back. By noon, she had eaten the last of the loaf, standing in the lee of a stone wall out of the wind, and by 3 o'clock, the light was already thinning, and her feet had begun to burn in the wet leather. She stopped at a spring that came out of a bank of moss beside the lane, and she drank from her cupped hand, and the water tasted of iron and of the roots of hawthorn, and she thought of Mrs. Poole, who had said that a girl who could find a clean spring would never quite die of thirst. She walked on. The lane climbed and dipped and climbed again, and the hedgerows on either side grew ragged and untrimmed and full of old man's beard, and the fields beyond them ran to rushes in the low places. She met no one for the last 2 miles. The wind came up out of the southwest and pushed at her back as if it, at least, were willing her forward. And just as the last of the daylight was going out of the sky, she came down the last slope of the lane and saw, standing off to her right, beyond a broken gate and a drive lost in hedge, the gray mass of the stone house at Dry Creek, roofless in one gable, dark against the darker hill behind it, waiting as it had waited for a great many years already, for someone who would look at it and see, not a ruin, but a thing that might yet be mended. She did not go up to the house that night. She slept in a hay barn, a quarter of a mile back down the lane, burrowed into the loose stuff at the back, where the wind could not reach her, with the sacking bundle for a pillow and the tin thimble held in the palm of her closed hand. In the morning she went to the solicitor at Nunney, whose name the man at the Ram had given her, a Mr. Bligh, who kept an office above a saddler's, and who was already at his desk at 8:30 when she knocked. He was a small, dry man of about 60, in a black coat gone green at the seams, and when she told him what she had come for, he laughed once, without unkindness, and said the house at Dry Creek had been on his books for 11 years, and that he had begun to think it would be there when they buried him. He said the freehold was clear, that the last owner had died without heirs the parish could find, that the escheat had run its course, that the fee to transfer was 1 shilling, and the deed stamp another, and that if she had 2 shillings honestly come by, the house and the 4 acres of glebe-land attached to it were hers. She laid the scrap of brown paper on his desk, and unfolded it. He counted the 2 shillings, wrote her name in a great ledger, drew up a paper in a fair round hand, made her sign it, sealed it with a drop of red wax from a stub of stick, and gave her the key, which was iron, 6 inches long, black with age, and heavy enough that she felt it drag at her coat pocket as she walked back the 7 miles to Dry Creek in a thin, cold rain. The house stood on a shelf of ground above the lane, 4 bays wide and 2 stories high, built of the grey Leah's stone that ran under all that country, with quoins and window heads of a warmer yellow stone she thought might be from Dolting. The slate roof had gone in over the east gable, and rain and jackdaws had had the run of the upper floor for a long time. The front door was oak, cracked down its length, its iron studs weeping rust into the wood, and the key turned in the lock only after she worked it back and forth for a full minute. Inside, the flagged hall ran the depth of the house, 22 paces from front to back, with a stair rising on the left in oak treads worn hollow in the middle, and 2 rooms opening on the right. The first was a parlor, some 16 feet by 14, with a plaster ceiling sagging like a wet sheet, and a lath showing through in 3 places. The second was a kitchen, larger, flagged in blue lias, with a wide-open hearth at the gable end, under a bessemer of blackened oak, 8 inches deep and 7 feet long. There was a bread oven set into the thickness of the wall to the left of the hearth, its iron door hanging by 1 hinge, and above the bessemer, a great chimney breast of rough stone, plastered and lime-washed and blackened, with 150 years of coal smoke and wood smoke together. The floors upstairs were sound where the roof had held, rotten where it had not. The windows had lost most of their glass, and the leads hung out of the stone mullions like the ribs of an opened fan. In the scullery beyond the kitchen she found a shallow stone sink, cracked but whole, a copper set in brick with its fire hole choked with birds' nests, and a pump whose handle screeched when she worked it, and gave, on the 7th stroke, a rusty brown gush, and then a clear, cold pull of water that ran and ran. She stayed. She swept the kitchen with a broom she made of hazel twigs. She stopped the worst of the parlor ceiling with a piece of sacking nailed up with tacks she drew from the scullery door. She slept the first night on the flags beside the kitchen hearth, wrapped in her Sunday dress and her coat and the sacking, with a fire of broken lath and windfall wood burning in the great open grate, and she woke stiff and cold and alive. For 4 days she worked at the kitchen, because the kitchen was the room she could make live. She swept the flags twice, and washed them once. She drew the jackdaws' nests out of the copper flue with a hooked stick, and burned them in the yard. She scrubbed the bread oven with sand and lye. And on the 5th morning she turned to the chimney breast, because Mrs. Poole had taught her that a chimney which smoked in the room, was a chimney that would kill you slowly, and this one smoked, and she meant to know why. She set a ladder of 2 barn planks against the bressumer, and climbed up with a hand brush and a bucket, and she began to scrape the soot and the loose lime off the face of the plaster above the beam. She worked for an hour. The plaster came away in flakes the size of playing cards, and under the plaster was rough stone rubble, as she had expected. And then, a foot to the left of the flue, and about 5 feet above the bressumer, the handle of her hand brush struck the wall, and the wall answered her, with a small dry note that was not the note stone makes. She stopped. She struck it again with the flat of her palm. The sound came back hollow, like the sound of a barrel a quarter full. She struck the wall 6 inches to the right of it, and got the dead thud of packed rubble. She struck 6 inches to the left, and got the same dead thud. Between those 2 thuds, there was a patch, about 18 inches square, that rang light and empty behind the plaster. She climbed down. She fetched from the scullery an iron bar she had found propping the copper lid, and she went back up. She chipped the plaster off in a widening square, until she saw what was underneath. Not stone, but brick. 4 courses of small brick, laid in a lime mortar that had gone soft with age and damp. The brickwork was clean-edged and neat, the work of a careful mason, and it had been set into an opening cut through the stone of the chimney breast itself. Someone had made a hole and then closed it up, and had done it well, and had done it so that a woman standing in the kitchen 100 years later would see nothing but a smooth, plastered wall. She worked the point of the bar into the mortar at the top of the patch and levered. The mortar crumbled. The first brick came loose, and she caught it in her hand and set it on the bressumer. The second came easier. The third and fourth came away together, and left a black hole into which she could not yet see, and out of which came a smell of dry paper, and old wool, and cold iron. She took 10 more bricks out one by one, and stacked them along the beam. When the hole was large enough for her arm, she reached in, and her fingers closed at once on the corner of a wooden box. It was a box of oak, about 10 inches by 8 by 6, with a plain iron hasp and no lock. She drew it out into the light. Its lid was furred with dust, and the wood was dry as a bone, and when she carried it down the ladder and set it on the scrubbed kitchen table, her hands were shaking, though her face, if there had been anyone to see it, was quite still. She wiped the lid with the corner of her apron. She lifted the hasp. She opened the box. Inside, laid on a folded square of gray flannel, were 3 small canvas bags, tied at the neck with tarred string, a folded paper sealed with a wafer of red wax, and, on top of the paper, a small pewter thimble, plain, worn bright at the rim, and dented on one side, in exactly the place where the tin thimble in her coat pocket was dented. She took up the folded paper first, and broke the wafer of red wax. The hand inside was upright and plain, a woman's hand taught to legibility rather than to flourish, and it ran thus: "To whoever finds this, my name is Mercy Barlow. I was born in this house in the year 1762, and I have lived in it, woman and girl, for 68 years. My husband was Thomas Barlow, wheelwright of this parish, dead these 9 years, and we had no children who lived out a first winter. What I have set aside is honest money, saved out of the wheelwright's shop and out of my needle. I have hid it, because I have no kin of my blood to leave it to, and I would rather it went to a body who had the wit to look for it, than to the parish chest. There are herein 52 sovereigns and 11 shillings, which is the whole of what I have. Whoever you are, I hope you have need of it, and I hope you will be kinder to this house than the years have been. God keep you. Mercy Barlow, in her 70th year, this 14th day of May, 1832. Emma read it once through, and then again standing up, and a third time sitting down. She folded it and laid it back under the pewter thimble. She untied the tarred string on the first bag, and sovereigns spilled onto the flannel with a heavy, soft sound she had never heard in her life. She counted them out in tens across the deal boards. 52 sovereigns, and 11 shillings loose in the bottom of the third bag, every coin true. She spent no time in astonishment. Mrs. Poole had taught her that a woman who sat still with money in her lap was a woman who lost it, and by first light the next morning, Emma was down the lane with 2 sovereigns in her pocket, and the rest sewn into the lining of her coat, behind the tin thimble. She went first to Mr. Bligh at Nunney, and laid 4 sovereigns on his desk against the arrears of land tax, and the deed stamp, and had his signature that the account was clear. She went next to the yard of Mr. Enoch Halfpenny, Slater of Mells, aged 58, a broad man with a squint, and a permanent whitening of lime along the seams of his sleeves, and hired him to make good the east gable. He came out the next Tuesday on a cart, with 140 Delabole slates lashed under sacking, a keg of oak pegs, a bucket of lime hair mortar, and a nailing hammer, with a claw worn smooth by 30 years' work. He walked the ridge as though it were a garden path, and by the end of the 4th day, the east gable was sound, and the rain went where rain should go. While Mr. Halfpenny was on the roof, Job Hendry came up the drive. Job Hendry was the parish carpenter of Dry Creek, aged 44, a quiet widower with 2 half-grown sons. He looked at the cracked oak of the front door, at the sagging parlor ceiling, and at the rotten treads of the stair, and told her what each would take. She wrote his figures into Mrs. Poole's ledger in her neat, down-slanted hand, and paid him half in advance and half at the finish. He planed new treads out of elm, pinned the door with dowels of ash, and hung it on new strap hinges, and set new laths across the parlor ceiling, and lime-plastered it in 3 coats. Mrs. Kettle came on the 2nd Sunday. Mrs. Kettle kept the village shop at Dry Creek. She was 51, a wide woman in a black bonnet, and she came up the drive with a basket over her arm, containing a loaf, a pat of butter wrapped in a dock leaf, and a stone jar of pickled damsons. She said she had known Mercy Barlow, and that Mercy had once sat 3 nights with her own mother, when the fever was in the village, and had taken nothing for it, and that if Mercy had put anything into Emma's hands, it was well put. She left the basket, and a message that Emma might have flour on account against her name at the counter, and she was the first person in Dry Creek to speak Emma's name aloud in the lane. After that, they came one by one. Mr. Ostler the glazier came down from Frome with a cart of leaded lights and a box of quarries cut to the sizes Emma had sent him on a scrap of paper. He was 70, worked slowly, and would not be hurried. He reset every mullion in the front of the house in 6 days, and took his pay in sovereigns and in cold pie Emma had learned to make from Mrs. Poole. Mrs. Trewin, the smith's wife, came with a jar of honey from her hives on the common, and stayed to help scrub the flags of the dairy at the back, where Emma meant to keep a cow. Old Mr. Yoe, who had been sexton of the parish for 40 years, came up one evening with a spade over his shoulder, and turned 2 rods of the kitchen garden without a word, and drank a cup of tea at the door, and went home. By the first week of March, the house had a roof that shed rain, a door that closed on its own hinges, glass in 17 windows, 4 sound rooms, and a copper in the scullery that boiled water without smoking the kitchen. Emma slept in the small chamber over the kitchen on a straw mattress laid on a rope bed Job Hendry had knocked together from 4 elm posts. She kept the pewter thimble and the tin thimble side by side on the mantel shelf over the parlor hearth, and she kept Mercy Barlow's letter folded flat in Mrs. Poole's ledger. She set herself to work, she knew. She whitewashed the dairy and bought 2 nanny goats from a farmer at Chantry. for 11 shillings the pair, and a young Alderney cow and calf from the Marlbrook home farm, for 6 sovereigns, brought over the hill by a boy who had known her father. She planted the 2 rods old Mr. Yeo had turned, with peas and broad beans and a row of onions, and she set thyme and sage and comfrey along the south wall, where the sun struck warmest. She hung her own sign at the gate, in a hand painted with lampblack and linseed on a slate, and it said only, E. Read. Plain sewing and mending taken in, because that was the trade she had first from Mrs. Poole, and it needed no capital but a needle, and the pewter thimble which she now wore. Women came, first from Dry Creek and then from Whatley and Eggford, with torn aprons, and turned collars, and boys' breeches gone through at the knee. She charged fairly, and mended honestly, and by Easter she had more work than the daylight of a day would carry. On Saturday afternoons, Mrs. Kettle sat an hour in her kitchen, with a cup of tea, and told her which children in the parish had grown out of which coats. On Sunday mornings, she walked down the lane to the parish church, and sat at the back, and by the end of April, the vicar had learned her name, and greeted her at the door. By the middle of May, the hedgerows along the drive were white with May blossom, and Emma had cut back the worst of the thorn, with a bill-hook Job Hendry lent her, and would not take back. In the evenings, when the sewing was set aside, and the goats were in, she sat on the low stone bench under the parlor window, with a cup of milk still warm from the pail, and looked at the house as a stranger might look at it. The east gable was sound. The slates lay in their courses, as Mr. Halfpenny had laid them, dark grey against the pale sky, and the ridge tiles were bedded straight. The oak door hung true on its new strap hinges, and closed with the small, clean sound of wood meeting wood. The 17 windows Mr. Ostler had glazed held the last of the light in small squares of leaded glass, and in the kitchen behind her, the fire burned in a chimney that no longer smoked into the room. She had learned in those months to walk her own floors, without listening for another woman's step behind her. She had learned to open the door of her own house to a knock, and not to wipe her hands first on an apron that belonged to somebody else. She thought sometimes of Mrs. Anstey, counting jars in the rectory pantry at Ashwell, and of the vicar turning his hat in his fingers in the passage, and of the 3 shillings and the small loaf, and the character folded in careful sloping hand, and she found that she bore them no grudge. They had counted her worth at 3 shillings, and set her on the road, and the road had brought her here. On the mantel shelf over the parlor hearth stood the 2 thimbles side by side, the tin one dented on its left, the pewter one dented on its right, worn bright at their rims in the same place, as though the 2 women who had used them had held their needles the same way. The tin thimble had been Mrs. Poole's mother's, and then Mrs. Poole's, and had come down out of Bath 30 years before Emma was born. The pewter thimble had been Mercy Barlow's, and had lain behind 4 courses of brick in the chimney breast for 40 years, waiting for a pair of hands to find it. Neither woman had ever seen Emma. Neither woman had borne a child who lived. Between them they had put into her hands a trade, a house, and 52 sovereigns, and 11 shillings of honest money, and a lesson that a girl without kin was not, on that account, a girl without inheritance. Mrs. Poole's ledger lay open on the parlor table, with Mercy Barlow's letter folded flat inside the front board, and beside it, Emma's own accounts, kept in the same neat, down-slanted hand Mrs. Poole had drilled into her at 15. Down one column ran the sovereigns paid to Mr. Bligh, Mr. Halfpenny, Job Hendry, Mr. Ostler. Down the other ran the pennies and shillings that came in from mended aprons and turned collars and letters written for those in the parish who could not write their own. The 2 columns were beginning, slowly, to look at one another as equals. She thought, on that evening in May, of William Reed, her father, in the byre at Marlbrook, teaching her to judge an egg by the sound of it against a pail, and of Hannah, her mother, whom she could scarcely remember, and of Mrs. Poole closing her eyes in the small back bedroom at Ashwell, and of Mercy Barlow, in her 70th year, sealing a folded paper with a wafer of red wax, and setting a pewter thimble on top of it, and laying 4 courses of brick over the whole. She thought that a house was not a set of walls, but a chain of hands, and that hers now was one link in that chain, and would, God willing, hold the next. Emma Reed was 23 and homeless. She had 2 shillings folded into a scrap of brown paper and a tin thimble in her coat pocket, and she spent the 2 shillings on a ruined estate in Dry Creek. It was the best 2 shillings she ever spent. If this story has kept you company for these 42 minutes, take a moment before you go and press the subscribe button and leave a word below to say where in the world you were sitting while you listened, whether it was a kitchen in the north of England, or a porch in Georgia, or a small flat in a city where nobody yet knows your name. These stories are told slowly, because the lives inside them were lived slowly, and they reach further when you share them with someone who needs to hear that a life counted out in shillings can still turn, on one honest morning's work, into a life counted out in hearths and hedgerows and Sunday walks down a familiar lane. Before you close the window, sit a moment longer and ask yourself the question Emma's story leaves behind. What has the world set down in front of you and called worthless? What thing, or place, or hour of your own labor have others walked past because they could not see the shape of what lay hidden inside it? And what might you find if, like a girl of 23 with nothing in her pocket but a tin thimble and a folded scrap of brown paper, you were willing to lay your hand against the wall behind the fireplace and listen for the hollow sound?